in the kitchen preparing lunch when Kelechi stormed in. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and painful. "What's taking so long with the food?" he demanded. "I'm almost done," Ada said, her voice shaking. "Just a few more minutes." "A few more minutes?" Kelechi snapped. "You've been in here for hours. Are you trying to starve me?" Before Ada could respond, he grabbed the pot of soup she was stirring and tipped it over, spilling the hot liquid onto the floor. Ada screamed as some of it splashed onto her legs, burning her skin. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "Clean this mess up," Kelechi shouted. "And don't make me wait for my food again." Ada sank to the floor, her body trembling as she tried to wipe up the spilled soup. Her legs throbbed from the burns, and her heart felt as though it might break. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to run, but she didn't have the strength. Not yet. Come and satisfy me." Ada stared at the ceiling of her small room at the shelter, her heart pounding. It had been 3 days since she left Kelechi, yet she couldn't shake the fear that he would find her. Each creak of the floorboards or knock at the door sent shivers down her spine. She sat up, gently rubbing her belly. "It's okay, my baby," she whispered. "We're safe here. No one can hurt us now." But even as she said the words, she wasn't entirely sure she believed them. Back at home, Kelechi was livid. He stormed around the house, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. He had called everyone he could think of, neighbors, friends, even her parents, but no one knew where Ada was. Or at least, that's what they claimed. "She's my wife," he yelled into the phone, speaking to one of his colleagues. "She can't just leave like that. She'll come crawling back, you'll see." But deep down, Kelechi wasn't so sure. Ada had never stood up to him before. He had always believed she was too weak, too dependent on him to ever leave. The thought that she might be gone for good made his blood boil. At the shelter, Ada was beginning to adjust to her new environment. The other women there had their own stories of pain and survival, and she found comfort in their shared experiences. Mrs. Iridi, the shelter's counselor, had been especially kind, encouraging Ada to speak openly about her struggles. During one of their sessions, Mrs. Iridi leaned forward, her expression calm and understanding. "Ada, have you thought about what you want to do next?" Ada hesitated, her hands resting on her belly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had a plan. I've always just survived." "You've already taken the hardest step," Mrs. Iredi said. "Now it's time to think about what kind of life you want for yourself and your child." Ada nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I just want us to be happy. I want my baby to grow up in a home filled with love, not fear." "You can have that," Mrs. Iredi said, "but it will take time and it will take strength. Are you ready for that journey?" "I think I am," Ada whispered. Meanwhile, Kelechi's desperation was growing. He began driving around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ada. He questioned shopkeepers, taxi drivers, even the children playing in the streets. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he had lost control. One evening, as he sat in his car outside Amaka's house, he saw her step outside with her husband. They didn't notice him at first, but when Amaka glanced in his direction, her face paled. She quickly whispered something to her husband, and they hurried back inside. "Oh, they know something," Kelechi muttered to himself. "They've been helping her." His anger flared, but he decided to play it smart. He wouldn't confront them directly, not yet. Instead, he would watch and wait. At the shelter, Ada received a message from Amaka. "Kelechi was outside our house today. Be careful, Ada. He's looking for you." Ada's heart sank. She clutched her phone tightly, her mind racing. She had been so careful, but it seemed Kelechi's determination was stronger than she had anticipated. She quickly showed the message to Mrs. Ireti. "We need to be cautious," Mrs. Ireti said. "If he comes here, we have security protocols in place. You're safe, Ada." But Ada wasn't convinced. The thought of Kelechi finding her sent chills down her spine. She couldn't let him take her back, not after everything she had endured. That night, as she lay in bed, Ada felt the baby move. It was a strong, steady kick, as though her child was reminding her to keep going. She smiled faintly, placing her hand on her belly. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "I'll protect you no matter what." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fight was far from over. Kelechi's obsession grew. He began spreading rumors, telling anyone who would listen that Ada had abandoned him. "She's an ungrateful woman," he told his friends. "After everything I've done for her, she just ran off." But his words didn't have the effect he had hoped. People began to question his story. Ada had always seemed quiet and kind, and Kelechi's temper was no secret. Whispers started to spread. What if Ada had left because she was afraid? Kelechi dismissed the rumors, but they only fueled his anger. He was determined to find Ada, not just to bring her back, but to reclaim his control. At the shelter, Ada began to find her strength. She attended counseling sessions, participated in group activities, and started to imagine a future free from fear. She even began working on a plan to support herself and her baby once they left the shelter. One day, as she was sitting in the garden, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The sun was warm on her skin, and for the first time she allowed herself to dream. But her peace was short-lived. That evening, as the women gathered for dinner, one of the staff members entered the room, her face pale. "Ada," she said quietly, "there's someone outside asking for you." Ada's heart stopped. She knew who it was before the woman even said his name. "It's Kelechi." The shelter's dining room fell silent as the staff member's words echoed through the air. Ada's stomach churned, and her hands instinctively went to her swollen belly. The other women glanced at her, their faces filled with concern. "It's Kelechi," the staff member repeated, her voice low. "He's outside demanding to speak with you." Ada felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She had dreaded this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt paralyzed. She turned to Mrs. Arity, who had been sitting with her moments earlier. "What do I do?" Ada whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Arity placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You stay right here," she said firmly. "This is a secure shelter. He cannot come inside without our permission." "But he's outside," Ada said, her breathing rapid. "He'll cause trouble. He won't leave." "Let me handle him," Mrs. Arity said. She gestured to another staff member. "Stay with Ada. Don't let her leave this room." As Mrs. Arity left the dining room, Ada felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. What if Kelechi refused to leave? What if he found a way inside? She couldn't let him take her back. Not now. Not ever. At the front gate, Kelechi paced back and forth, his face twisted in anger. He banged on the iron bars, shouting loudly, "Aita, I know you're in there. Come out here and face me." Mrs. Arity approached the gate calmly, flanked by 2 male staff members for support. She kept her expression neutral as she addressed him. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you?" "Where's my wife?" Kelechi demanded, gripping the bars tightly. "I know she's here. Let me in." "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private facility," Mrs. Arity said evenly. "We cannot allow you to enter without proper authorization." "She's my wife," Kelechi shouted. "You have no right to keep her here." "She is a guest here," Mrs. Arity said firmly. "And as long as she chooses to stay, we are obligated to protect her. Please lower your voice and leave the premises." Kelechi's face turned red with fury. "Protect her? From what? I'm her husband. She belongs with me." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make," Mrs. Arity replied. "Ada is an adult, and she has chosen to seek refuge here. If you have concerns, I suggest you address them through legal channels." "Legal channels?" Kelechi sneered. "You think I need the law to deal with my own wife?" "Let me tell you something, sir," one of the male staff members interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You need to leave now. If you refuse, we will have no choice but to call the police." Kelechi froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He could tell these people were serious. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Fine," he spat, "but this isn't over. Ada can't hide from me forever." With that, he turned and stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. Inside the shelter, Ada sat on the edge of her chair, her hands trembling. She could hear faint bits of Kelechi's shouting from outside, and it made her stomach churn. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until the staff member next to her spoke softly. "He's gone, Ada. You're safe now." Ada exhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face. "What if he comes back?" she whispered. "He won't stop. We won't let him near you," the staff member said reassuringly. "You're not alone anymore." That night, Ada barely slept. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. But as the hours passed, she reminded herself of what Mrs. Iretti had said. She was safe here. Kelechi couldn't control her anymore. The next morning, during their counseling session, Ada opened up to Mrs. Iretti about her fears. "He won't stop looking for me," she said. "And when he finds me, he'll hurt me." "He might try," Mrs. Iretti acknowledged. "But you have taken the first step in reclaiming your life, Ada. You're stronger than you think, and you have people who will stand by you. You are not going back to that house." Ada nodded, her resolve growing. She had come too far to give up now. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without Kelechi, a future where she and her baby could thrive. 2 weeks later, Kelechi's anger boiled over. He had been visiting every place he could think of, asking anyone who might know where Ada was. His frustration turned to desperation, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. One evening, under the cover of darkness, Kelechi parked his car a block away from the shelter. He waited patiently, watching the building from a distance. His plan was simple: wait for someone to leave the gate open and sneak inside. But what he didn't know was that the shelter had already anticipated his moves. The security team had installed cameras and reinforced their protocols after his first visit. When Kelechi approached the gate, the motion sensors triggered an alarm, alerting the staff. Within minutes, the police arrived. Kelechi's attempt to force his way in ended with him in handcuffs, shouting and struggling as the officers led him away. When Ada heard the news, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She didn't want to celebrate Kelechi's downfall, but she couldn't deny the sense of freedom that came with knowing he was no longer a threat. As she sat in the garden, her hand resting on her belly, Ada felt the baby kick again. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile. She had survived. She had taken control of her life, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and strength. For the first time in weeks, Ada woke up feeling light. Knowing that Kelechi had been arrested brought her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. The shelter felt like a sanctuary now, and she began to dream of a future for herself and her baby. Ada spent her mornings in the garden, where she started journaling about her hopes and fears. The act of putting pen to paper felt therapeutic, as though she was reclaiming the voice Kelechi had silenced for so long. One morning, as Ada sat on a wooden bench under the shade of a mango tree, Mrs. Iretti joined her. The older woman had become a source of wisdom and comfort for Ada, guiding her through her healing journey. "How are you feeling today, Ada?" she asked, her tone warm. "I feel free," Ada said, smiling faintly, but also uncertain. "I don't know what comes next." "That's normal," Mrs. Iretti said. "Healing is a process, and the road ahead won't always be easy. But you've already taken the hardest step. The rest will fall into place." Ada nodded, her hand resting on her belly. "I just want my baby to have a better life than I did. And you're already making that happen," Mrs. Iretti said. "Your courage is creating a brighter future for both of you." Meanwhile, Kelechi wasn't taking his arrest lightly. Though he had been released on bail, the humiliation of being handcuffed and taken away like a common criminal burned in his mind. He couldn't believe Ada had gone this far. "She thinks she's won," Kelechi muttered to himself as he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "She has no idea who she's dealing with." Kelechi's anger turned into obsession. He began to devise a plan, determined to bring Ada back under his control. This time, he wouldn't rely on brute force or empty threats. He would play the long game, manipulating her into believing he had changed. A week later, Ada received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, and her heart sank as she recognized Kelechi's familiar scrawl. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The words inside made her stomach churn. "My dearest Ada, I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt you. I can't begin to express how sorry I am for everything I've done. You didn't deserve the pain I caused, and I hate myself for driving you away. I've started counseling, Ada. I'm trying to change. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be the husband and father you deserve. Please give me a chance to prove myself. Let me be there for you and our baby. I'll wait for you, Ada, no matter how long it takes. I'll wait. Yours always, Kelechi." Ada's hands shook as she read the letter. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Could Kelechi really change? Was it possible that the man she had once loved was still there, buried beneath the anger and pride? She brought the letter to Mrs. Yuriki, who read it carefully before meeting Ada's gaze. "What do you think about this?" she asked. "I don't know," Ada admitted. "I want to believe him, but I'm scared." "It's natural to feel conflicted," Mrs. Ireti said. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. Kelechi has a history of manipulation. Be cautious." Days passed, and Ada tried to focus on herself and her baby, but Kelechi's letter lingered in her mind. She didn't respond, hoping he would take her silence as an answer. Instead, he sent more letters, each one more desperate than the last. One evening, as Ada prepared for bed, a loud knock echoed through the shelter. Her heart raced as she heard voices at the gate. It was Kelechi. "I just want to see her," he shouted. "Please, I need to talk to my wife." The staff acted quickly, calling the police and escorting Ada to a secure room. But as she sat there, tears streaming down her face, Ada realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. When the police arrived and removed Kelechi from the premises, Ada felt a surge of determination. She had spent so much of her life living in fear, but she wasn't going to let him control her anymore. The next morning, Ada made a decision. She called Amaka and Chike, who had been her unwavering supporters since the beginning. "I want to take legal action," Ada said. "I want to protect myself and my baby for good." Amaka's voice was filled with pride. "We'll help you every step of the way." With the shelter's guidance, Ada filed a restraining order against Kelechi. She also began gathering evidence for a case of domestic violence, using her journal and photos of her injuries as proof. It wasn't an easy process, but with each step, Ada felt a little stronger. In the weeks that followed, Ada began to rebuild her life. She enrolled in a program for single mothers, where she learned skills that would help her find a job after the baby was born. She also started attending therapy, where she confronted the pain of her past and began to heal. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden, she felt the baby kick harder than ever before. She smiled, placing her hand on her belly. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise." Meanwhile, Kelechi's world began to crumble. His attempts to control Ada had backfired, and his reputation in the community was in ruins. People began to distance themselves from him, and he found himself isolated and bitter. But Ada didn't think about Kelechi anymore. She was focused on her future, a future filled with hope, strength, and love. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The courtroom was filled with tension as Ada sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. This was a moment she had never imagined for herself, a fight for justice against the man who had once been her entire world. Across the room, Kelechi sat stiffly, his jaw clenched and his eyes cold. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he didn't respond. His pride had brought him here, and now it seemed like it would be his undoing. Ada's lawyer, a confident woman named Barrister Ngozi, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client has endured years of abuse at the hands of her husband, Kelechi. She has the right to protection, restitution, and the means to care for herself and her unborn child." She presented Ada's journal, photos of her injuries, and statements from witnesses including Amaka and Chike. The evidence painted a damning picture of Kelechi's behavior. The judge listened intently, his expression growing graver with each piece of evidence. When it was Kelechi's turn to speak, he stood and addressed the court with a defiant tone. "Your Honor, this is all exaggerated. Ada's just trying to ruin me. She left on her own, she wasn't forced. But Kelechi's words fell flat against the mountain of evidence. His lawyer struggled to refute the claims, and the judge's patience wore thin. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. Based on the evidence presented, I find the defendant, Kelechi, guilty of domestic abuse and emotional cruelty. I am awarding the plaintiff, Ada, full ownership of the marital property and financial compensation for damages. Furthermore, a restraining order will be issued against the defendant. Ada felt tears streaming down her face as the judge's words sank in. She had won. She had finally broken free from Kelechi's grasp, and now she had the means to build a new life for herself and her child. Kelechi's face twisted in anger as he stood to leave. "This isn't over, Ada," he spat. "You'll regret this." But Ada didn't respond. She turned away from him, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and determination. She had fought for her freedom, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. A few weeks later, Ada stood in the living room of her new home, a modest but beautiful house she had purchased with the money awarded to her in court. It wasn't lavish, but it was hers. For the first time, she felt safe. Amaka and Chike visited often, helping her prepare for the arrival of her baby. They painted the nursery in soft pastel colors and filled it with baby clothes, toys, and a crib. "You're going to be an amazing mother," Amaka said one afternoon as they arranged baby clothes in the dresser. Ada smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you and Chike. Thank you." "You're the one who found the strength to leave," Amaka said. "We just stood by you." One evening, as Ada rested on the couch, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen. Her breath hitched, and she clutched her belly. The baby was coming. "Amaka!" she called out. "It's time!" Amaka rushed her to the hospital, where the nurses quickly got Ada settled in a delivery room. Hours of labor followed, filled with pain and anticipation, but when the doctor finally placed a crying baby in her arms, Ada's exhaustion melted away. "It's a girl," the doctor said, smiling warmly. Ada looked down at her daughter, her heart overflowing with love. The baby had chubby cheeks, a head full of soft hair, and bright eyes that seemed to take in the world. "Welcome to the world, my little angel," Ada whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're my miracle." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and new routines, but Ada embraced every moment. She named her daughter Chiamaka, meaning God is good, as a reminder of the strength and blessings that had brought her to this point. One afternoon, as she sat in the nursery rocking Chiamaka to sleep, Ada thought about how far she had come. She had faced her greatest fears, fought for her freedom, and built a new life for herself and her child. The shadows of her past no longer haunted her. Kelechi's threats no longer held power over her. She was free, she was strong, and she was determined to give her daughter the life she deserved. As Chiamaka stirred in her arms, Ada smiled and kissed her forehead. "We're going to be okay, my baby," she whispered. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to thrive." Months had passed since Ada brought her baby girl, Chiamaka, into the world. Her days were now filled with laughter, the sound of soft coos, and the warmth of unconditional love. Chiamaka had become her entire world, a symbol of hope and resilience. Ada had begun to rebuild her life with a renewed sense of purpose. She had secured a remote job through the shelter's network, allowing her to work while caring for her baby. Amaka and Chiki continued to visit, helping her whenever they could. For the first time in years, Ada felt like she had a chance at true happiness. But happiness, it seemed, was fleeting. One crisp morning, as Ada sat in her living room feeding Chiamaka, there was a loud knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare, and something about the forceful knock unsettled her. She carefully placed Chiamaka in her crib and went to the door. Peering through the peephole, she froze. Standing outside were Kelechi and 3 of his relatives: his mother, his older brother, and his cousin. Ada's stomach turned. She opened the door just slightly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "What do you want, Kelechi?" Kelechi smirked, leaning against the door frame. "I've come to see my daughter." Ada's hand tightened on the door. "You have no right to be here. The court granted me full custody. You're not allowed near us." His mother, Mama Kelechi, stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's nonsense. Chiamaka is Kelechi's blood. She belongs to our family. You can't keep her from us as my child." Ada replied firmly, "And the court's decision is final. You need to leave." Kelechi's brother chimed in, his voice laced with condescension. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Ada. We're here to claim what's rightfully ours. You can't raise that child on your own." Ada's eyes blazed with anger. "I don't need your help, and Chiamaka doesn't belong to anyone but me. Now get off my property." Kelechi's smirk disappeared, replaced by a sneer. "You think you can talk to me like that? This isn't over, Ada. You'll hear from my lawyer." As soon as they left, Ada locked the door and called Amaka, her hands shaking. "They were here," she said, her voice trembling. "Kelechi and his family. They want Chiamaka." "Stay calm," Amaka said firmly. "They have no legal grounds to take her. We'll talk to your lawyer and make sure they don't come near you again." True to his word, Kelechi filed a petition in court, claiming joint custody of Chiamaka. In the filing, he accused Ada of being unfit to raise their child on her own. His family supported his claims, adding fuel to the fire by spreading rumors about Ada in the community. Ada was devastated. She couldn't understand how Kelechi, after all he had done, had the audacity to demand custody of Chiamaka, but she refused to back down. With Barrister Ngozi by her side, Ada prepared for the battle ahead. "We'll prove that Chiamaka is safest with you," Ngozi assured her. "Kelechi has no case. Stay strong." The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Kelechi arrived with his family, their confident demeanor a stark contrast to Ada's quiet determination. She sat with Ngozi, clutching a small photo of Chiamaka in her hands. Kelechi's lawyer argued that, as the child's father, Kelechi had a right to be involved in her life. "My client is a respected member of the community," the lawyer said. "He has the resources and support system to provide Chiamaka with a stable upbringing." Ngozi stood and presented her case. "Your Honor, my client has full custody of Chiamaka, as granted by this very court. She has created a loving, stable home for her daughter, despite the trauma she endured at the hands of the defendant. Allowing him and his family access to the child would put both mother and child at risk." She presented evidence of Kelechi's abusive behavior, including testimonies from Amaka, Chike, and staff members at the shelter. She also showed financial records proving that Ada was capable of supporting Chiamaka on her own. When Kelechi took the stand, his arrogance shone through. "Ada has poisoned this court against me," he said, his tone bitter. "I just want to be a father to my child." Ngozi's cross-examination was sharp. "Mr. Kelechi, were you not arrested outside the shelter where Ada was staying? Did you not ignore the court's restraining order and attempt to force your way inside?" Kelechi faltered. "I was desperate. She's my wife." "She's not your wife," Ngozi interrupted. "She is a survivor of your abuse, and this court has already recognized her as the sole custodian of your child." After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge delivered the final verdict. This court finds no evidence to support the defendant's claims of joint custody. The child, Chiamaka, will remain in the sole custody of her mother, Ada. Furthermore, the restraining order against the defendant is extended for an additional 3 years. Any violation of this order will result in immediate legal consequences. Ada's knees nearly buckled as relief washed over her. She had won again. Chiamaka was safe. As Kelechi and his family left the courtroom, their faces dark with anger, Ada held her head high. She cradled Chiamaka in her arms, whispering softly, "We're free now, my love. No one will take you from me." Outside the courthouse, Amaka and Chike were waiting. Amaka hugged Ada tightly. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "Chiamaka is yours and no one can take her away." Ada smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." As they drove back home, Ada looked at her daughter, who was fast asleep in her car seat. Chiamaka's tiny fingers twitched as she dreamed, and Ada felt a renewed sense of hope. This was the life she had fought for, a life of freedom, love, and endless possibilities. And as long as she had Chiamaka, Ada knew she could face anything. Moral lesson: Ada's story serves as a reminder that strength lies in resilience and the power to stand up for oneself. It teaches that no one deserves to endure abuse, and that seeking help is a sign of courage, not weakness. Justice may take time, but the truth always prevails. For Kelechi, his downfall highlights the consequences of pride, anger, and unchecked power. His actions cost him everything: his freedom, his family, and his reputation. The story reminds us that no one is above the law and that abusive behavior will eventually be met with justice. Above all, this story is about hope, that even in the darkest moments, there is a way forward. With support, courage, and faith, it's possible to build a brighter future. Ada held Chimaka close as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden. "We made it, my baby," she whispered. "This is just the beginning." And with that, Ada stepped into a new chapter of her life, determined to write it with love, strength, and peace.